Kia ora koutou, good evening everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening as we talk about housing, how to deal with this hot mess. So joining us this evening, we have our party leader, economist Geoff Simmons. We have our candidate for Southland, Joel Rowlands. And together in Nelson this evening, though not usually, we have our candidate for Nelson, Matthew Pottinger, and our candidate for Te Atatū, Brendon Monk. And down in, where are you on my screen? Ben Atkinson is our candidate in Banks Peninsula. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. And my name is Shina Vaught. I am the Deputy Leader of TOP, and I am chairing our chat about housing this evening. And this is actually really great timing because I made the mistake of listening to Talkback Radio today, and they were talking today about our huge housing mess. But of course, they had the usual voices on there talking about how great it is that we can just keep making money off each other and selling properties to each other like it's a great thing, and pretending that it's not a pyramid scheme, and pretending that it's not just the older generation stealing money from the younger generations. It was a great chat. So to explain why it's much more complicated than just buying and selling houses off each other, we have a wealth of knowledge here this evening. So I will start though with what is the most common talked about part of this problem, which is supply. So we'll start with that because that is certainly a part of our issue. So starting off our chat this evening, Brendon Monk, who I just introduced you to as our candidate for Te Atatū, is also TOP's Housing and Urban Development Spokesperson. Brendon, how are you?
Good. Kia ora, everyone. So I'm Brendon Monk. I am an architect by trade. I've been an architect for close to 25 or 30 years now. So I've worked in the field of architecture, urban design, all that time, including some stints overseas. I've designed housing and buildings from Auckland down to Queenstown. I worked on TOP's housing and urban development policy. Now, on the supply side, everyone knows that housing problems are to do with supply and demand. On the supply side, the big problem we have is we just simply have not been building enough houses. More importantly, we haven't been building them where we need them, and that's in our cities. The reason for that is we've had extremely restrictive planning rules in all of our cities right throughout the country that have prevented development. It's stopped us building the kind of houses we need, the sustainable sort, which means building up, not out. Now, what's caused that? All of our city councils have really, really failed to allow intensive development. Part of it is because they don't have the money to actually build the infrastructure needed in the cities. Now, we'll get into how TOP are going to sort that out later, but they just have not been funded well enough. Local councils own about 40% of the infrastructure in the country, and they've got a pittance of the funding to deal with it. They can't do anything. They can't sort out the water problems, the sewer problems, and we can't actually design proper public transport to allow the hubs we need to actually build intensive development around them. So we've got to sort out our whole urban development strategy. Another problem, our building industry is in a big mess. Gosh, our building materials are way expensive, and we have problems right throughout the whole supply chain. We have problems in actually getting the amount of the right sort of contractors we need. There's a big problem there. And we have not been building enough social housing. Things like Kiwi Build just cannot build the numbers we need. We need to partner with non-government organisations and community groups in all of our communities and actually work with them through Kāinga Ora, give them the land they need, all of the tools they need to own and manage social housing. That's the way forward. Look, that's enough for now on the supply side. These are the major issues facing us. Now, in the questions later, we'll talk about the real solutions we have. So yeah, back to you, Shai.
Thank you so much, Brendon. That was a great start. So yes, we need huge changes around the planning rules in our cities to make sure that we're building up, not out. Speaking as an Aucklander, that is a huge issue that we've seen where key agricultural land around our city outskirts have been taken away for housing. We lost that key agricultural land that we will never get back. That actually, created jobs and exports. But we will come back to that later. So the next issue I want to talk about is because it is supply and demand, and we need to talk about the demand side of this problem. That is the lesser spoken about for various reasons issues. So I'm going to throw this over to Geoff, our leader, economist, Geoff Simmons. Please, if you need the graphs, I can show them up.
Yes, please. If we can put up the graph from the tax working group, that would be great, because kia ora, folks. As Shai mentioned, I'm Geoff. I'm an economist, and we have known about the problems on the demand side for some time in New Zealand. This has been talked about since we reformed our tax system in the 1980s. We have some of the highest tax rates on other forms of investment, so that's businesses, bank deposits, KiwiSaver, all that sort of stuff. We have some of the highest taxes on those forms of investments in the Western world, and some of the lowest tax rates on housing. And this, like I said, has been a problem since the late 1980s. And economists at the time said that this was going to cause issues down the line, because the difference between how we tax property and how we tax other investments gives this massive incentive to invest in property. And like I said, we have the biggest incentive to invest in property in the Western world. So no surprise that we invest more of our money in property than anywhere in the Western world. Now, the prediction back in the late 80s, early 90s, when our tax system reform was made, because back then there was this conversation about how we needed a capital gains tax that had to include the family home. That was very much the conversation at the time. This was before house prices started to go crazy. And so the conversation then was saying we needed to have this tax brought in. Otherwise, we were going to see more and more money be put into property. And the economists at the time said, well, one of two things will happen. Either if supply is restricted, we will see the prices rise. If supply isn't restricted, what they said was you'll still see Kiwis piling into housing because it's tax favored over other forms of investment, but you'll see our houses getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, what we've seen over the last 30 years since that tax change has happened is both. New Zealand has had the highest rise in house prices in the Western world, and we've also had the biggest increase in the size of our homes in the Western world. We actually don't have a housing problem, because if you include all of the spare bedrooms that are out there, we could easily house all of our homeless and still have plenty of spare bedrooms in the country for people to come and stay in. Because we built these enormous homes, because again, people are putting lots and lots of money into the family home. So Brendon's talked about the supply side issue. Because of that supply side issue, we have seen a massive growth in house prices. In the last 10 years, that has also come about because of high levels of immigration. That has driven the demand side as well. But the tax issue is the really big issue that we've had for the last 30 years. And that's why house prices have grown faster than rents and faster than incomes for the last 30 years, making house prices the most unaffordable in the world. Do we have that graph we can put up, which shows the house price growth? It's you're holding it upside down, Shai. Under National and under Labor, house prices have increased faster than incomes, and that now this is one race that we don't want to win, but house prices are the most unaffordable in the Western world. So that's a brief history of the demand side of this issue.
Thanks, Geoff. So in short, there's a huge hole in our tax system. It tells people to invest in housing compared to any other investment. Other investments like our businesses that would actually create jobs and exports. And so that segues me nicely into asking Matt Pottinger, who's our candidate in Nelson, TOP's UBI and tax spokesperson, to explain how this mess, our housing mess, it's not just a housing crisis for poor people, right? Which is the most crudest interpretation that we seem to be hearing a lot of the time. But it is far more complex than that, and it actually has a direct impact on our economy generally. So I'd like to segue that into you explaining a little bit more about the impact on the economy.
Yeah, thanks, Shai. So the obsession with housing has got us to a point now where we have more of our money tied up in property than any other country. And when we've done that, it means it's at the expense of putting that money into things like businesses or other investments, which can, in the case of businesses, grow jobs and create exports. So we've doubled down so hard on property in a huge part because of the incentives around it and the fact that the tax system is telling us to do this. So it means that our businesses are starved of capital. It means that, as far as New Zealand's concerned, we don't really invest in R&D. Our businesses spend not as much as we really should be in R&D to grow them, to increase our productivity, because that's the sort of story here as well, is to say that New Zealand has lagged behind in our productivity. So that's GDP per hour worked. It's sort of how much stuff we're making per hour or how much value we're creating. We've been lagging on that metric for so long, and we are lagging even further behind Australia now. And so if we want to see, higher wages, if we want to improve our standard of living, we're going to need to fix these incentives that mean we pile all our cash into property. One final point here is that it also stifles entrepreneurship, okay? Because we've got the next generation of entrepreneurs coming through, and the moment that they leave school, the most sensible decision that they should make, given that for the last 30 years, rents have been rising faster than incomes, they should buy a house as quickly as possible. Now, that would be fine if houses were roughly 3 times household incomes. But here in little old New Zealand, we found ourselves all the way up at 7 times median household income. So what that means is that entrepreneurs who, again, the most rational thing for them to do would be to buy a house as soon as possible. It also means that they'll be $600,000 in debt, and that's one heavy ball and chain dragging them down in terms of their ability to grow their business and actually turn it into something special.
That's absolutely right. And the other side as well is that's probably less spoken about is, when we're spending a bigger chunk of our income every week on our living costs, whether it's going towards our rent or our mortgage, that is less money that we have available to spend back in the economy, to spend back in our businesses. You are shrinking people's purchasing power out there in our economy.
Absolutely.
It's just absurd. But as you say, Matthew, we're told, the system tells people that is the most rational, logical thing to do with your money. Put it in housing because we know it only goes up. And so often we are hearing the same conversations over and over again. Get on the property ladder, you're going to be great. It's a great thing. That's how you can make money. We'll just make money off each other constantly. It's great. We'll just push those costs down. Let the next guys coming on pay for it. Not our problem. Right? This is the same idea that housing is this get rich quick scheme and how great. It doesn't matter that it doesn't create jobs. And doesn't matter that we're not spending hardly any money on our R&D, as you said. It's just this crazy thing. And this problem gets to every level of our society. And I'm going to get to homelessness and our social housing, because this is something really important. And I suspect that a lot of people who voted for Labour last time perhaps did so hoping and optimistically hoping that they would do something very real about this housing crisis. But what we've actually seen, and I will get Ben to confirm these numbers, but it's effectively in 2017, there were 5,000 people nationally on the wait list for social housing. Today, that number is over 18,000 people waiting to get into housing.
I think that's households, actually, not just people. It's 18,000 households. Yeah.
So Ben, sorry, I would now like to invite Ben and Joel to speak with us more about this side of the problem, because this is the very real human impact of this entire problem in the worst way. So maybe Ben, if we just jump to you just on those numbers, and then Joel, I'd love you to help us help explain the process involved and what it's like on the ground for these application processes and how difficult it is to get into social housing.
Kia ora, thanks Shai. My name's Ben Atkinson. I'm the candidate in Banks Peninsula. My day-to-day mahi is that I'm a housing facilitator. It's a pretty unique role in our country. There's not many people that do my job. My job is actually working with clients, tangata whai ora, with mental health and addiction issues into housing. So most of my clients are incidental homeless. They might be couch surfing, sleeping in cars, having a broken relationship, and are on the street. So often I put these people into emergency housing. So that was put in place by National originally, and currently it's costing the government a lot of money, and we've found a bit of a bottleneck where people actually can't get out of emergency housing into social housing. Like Shai mentioned before, we've seen a 350% increase in the social housing waitlist in 3 years. It's gone from 5,300 to 18,500. Now, those figures were released just 2 weeks ago with the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development's public housing report. They release that every 3 months. So we can actually keep a pretty good real-time view on what's happening with those numbers. In the last 2 years, we've seen the need for social housing rise by almost 10,000, but only an increase of 4,000 social housing properties. That's both Kāinga Ora, which is the old Housing New Zealand, which is the central government provider, and also from community housing providers. We've actually seen that community housing providers are providing over 60% of the social housing stock in the last couple of years. So social housing is bottlenecked like crazy at the moment. There's only around 3,000 transitional providers nationwide. There's only 71,000 social housing properties nationwide. Nationwide, we put 9,000 odd people into emergency housing in the last 3 months. So that's motels at a cost of just under $80 million, which is up $26 million from the previous quarter. Obviously, COVID had a real big part to play in that. But because we've got so many people in motels, so little transitional options, which is where people go after the motel before they get a social housing property, that it's just bottlenecked now. So people are sitting in motels for months on end. People are sitting in transitional for months on end. The private housing sector is so destroyed that people don't ever want to leave social housing. You know, we're looking for a 1-bedroom flat for someone in Canterbury right now, minimum $250 a week, and it's usually not a very nice place. For someone on the benefit down here, they get around $250 after tax. Once the winter energy payment's gone, they get $105 accommodation supplement, which means that they're spending 5/7 of their income on rent. And it's not even comfortable rent. Push that over to you, Joel.
Yeah, kia ora. So I'm going to kind of segue off a little bit and just tell you a little bit more about my personal experience with housing. My parents were very, very successful real estate agents. So growing up, we'd buy a house. They'd buy a house for $280,000. They'd chuck 60 grand in and sell it for 400. Every year, we'd buy a new house. They'd do it up and would sell it. And then eventually we were living in mansions. So I've lived in mansions and it was all great. I was a 13-year-old boy with my own ensuite. And when I left the nest, I quickly realized that things weren't as easy for everybody else. When I first moved to Queenstown, I was able to afford a I was able to rent a place, a 3-bedroom house in the middle of town for $380 a week. That same place now is probably around $1,000 a week, and it's not even being used as a house anymore. It's been used as an office for a pizza place. And at the time I was on $25 an hour, and now I'm on $22 an hour. So the price of living has skyrocketed. So the rent's basically tripled, and my wages have not gone up, but gone down. So then I ended up inheriting my old family cat, and I didn't really want to put it down. So it was 16 at the time, and I couldn't find anywhere in Queenstown that would let me have the cat. So I called up the local campground, and I basically said, look, I've got this cat. I need a place to live. Can you help? And they said, yeah, as long as the cat gets along with all the other cats. I said, great, I'll move in. How much? $180 for a caravan. I lived in that caravan for 5 years. I met a wonderful girl. We've both been working hard. We're key workers in town. So she's a seamstress. She makes all the wedding dresses and stuff for all the weddings in town. I'm a screen printer. So I basically provide town with every single t-shirt that's been worn by everyone or sold by all the tourism businesses. But we're both still living in a campground. We couldn't even afford to even look at anywhere with the wages that we were on. So once we had a couple of kids, I started to realize that we were quickly outgrowing our little humble abode, and I started to research state housing. And what I found out was that there was 850 state houses in Southland, but now there's only 350. The previous government was selling them to property developers and turning them into Airbnbs in the middle of a housing crisis. There's, as you said, Ben, there's a lot of people that are on waiting lists, and there's also these community trusts that have been set up in Queenstown, which are basically kind of land grabs. So they retain the land. Me and Brendon spoke about this before. He'd be able to explain it better, but it's just the whole thing stinks. So how hard it is to get a state house? Basically, there's all these different tiers. So you have to prove that you don't earn enough money, or you have, and there's all these different aspects as well. So we've got kids. There's rats that have moved into the campground, into the roof of the caravan. They've started to burrow a nest into the kids' room because we had 3 heaters in there pumping it to keep the place warm, because there's so many nooks and crannies within the caravan that the heat just escapes. So you're paying massive, massive power bills. You know, I'm talking like some of the power bills that I've paid in my lifetime living in that caravan, $700-800 a month, just for power, just to keep these kids warm. All these rats think this is a great idea. They're going to move in. And then me and my partner couldn't sleep because they're scratching around constantly at night. So I got some poison and ended up getting rid of them, but they all died inside the walls and started to rot inside the walls. So I pulled off the panel, sent the kids down to Gore where their grandparents are, and took pictures of everything and started building a profile. So basically, once you get onto the list, you just have to keep harassing them constantly, calling them up daily, weekly, to reassess your situation or see where you are on that level. And if you can prove that you're fat, basically, if you can prove that your kids are getting sick, then you have a far higher chance of getting a state house. There was only 9 left in Queenstown, and the one that I'm in was actually had an elderly couple that had to stay in place for 28 years. They had a daughter that was living in the next state house over the way, and the daughter was living with them, and they were subletting the other state house out for rental, like $200 a week to like foreign students and stuff like that. So fully milking the system, you know. And so luckily for us, that they got found out, and this state house became available. And I had built up enough of a profile. I mean, basically, the thing with state housing is the squeaky bearing gets the oil. So if you just keep hammering home how you're gonna do it, then that's the only way. So we were lucky enough to. Sorry, I can't explain everything so well. I've had a busy day. we were lucky to get the one of 9 state houses left in Queenstown, and yeah, and it really, really wasn't easy. They make so much red tape and there's so much bureaucracy, and they really try to disincentivize you for even applying. And then once you're even on the list, they just make it harder and harder and harder. You've jumped through this hoop, then they'll put up another one. You've got to jump through that hoop. You've got to constantly provide them with paperwork and information. Luckily for me, you know, I'm passionate and I don't let go of things too easily. So I'm constantly, you know, at these people's necks, so to speak. But there's a lot of people that are marginalized and in that situation that just give up hope. And that's where you find people ending up living in cars and living in tents and going homeless because they just can't deal with all this other stuff that is that goes with even trying to apply for a state home. And that is completely against what these state homes are purposely built for. I mean, you know.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like the health system, Joel. I mean, you know, that whole idea of the squeaky wheel getting the oil, and so you have to keep pestering, and it's almost like the system is set up to sort of scare people off as a way of rationing, I guess.
Yeah, totally.
Access. The other thing that really struck me about what yourself and Ben were saying was, well, the amount of money spent on that transitional accommodation, that's the emergency housing, which is you know, just astounding, and also this you know, that, you know, people think of homelessness as people living on the street, or as you say, living in cars, but as you mentioned, Ben, there's also people, you know, couch surfing. There's also people living in campgrounds, as you were talking about, Joel. You know, so there's all this kind of hidden homelessness that we just don't really even see or talk about.
And they just don't have loud enough voices. You know, I think listening to, you know, you speak, Joel, and hearing it, that's your experience. I do not think enough Kiwis fundamentally understand how bad it is. And the fact that you only get somewhere because children are getting sick.
Yeah.
That is just disgusting. And I just, honestly, I'm almost lost for words, because every time I hear this, it just hits me in the heart. And I don't understand any Kiwi who can hear this and not be affected and not want to fundamentally do everything they can to fix this broken, messed up system, because it is disgusting. And neither National nor Labour have done anything to fix this. And it actually makes me sick.
I'm with you.
A lot of people would, hearing that, would then probably be not surprised to learn that New Zealand is a real outlier in the Western world in having alarming increasing rates of rheumatic fever, which is a disease of poverty linked to damp, cold, house.
You're right, Brendon. And we spend over $5 billion a year on that disease and related diseases because
respiratory
of
diseases,
respiratory diseases, sorry, because of damp, moldy homes.
Yeah.
This is not the New Zealand that we think it is. This is not this fair, equality of opportunity, lovely world that we think that we live in.
Ben, you were nodding through Joel's story. Was that actually fairly typical?
Absolutely. I mean, it's my job every day to advocate for those people that were in Joel's shoes. You know, and I mean, with people like with severe bipolar or paranoid schizophrenics, people with crippling addictions, people with criminal histories. There's so many, well, we call them, like Joel was talking about, priority ratings. So it's split into 5 different categories. Each category is ranked out of 4. So someone who's an A20 would be a very high rating and should theoretically get housed quite quickly. However, a lot of people don't know how to advocate for themselves. So when I'm doing like a social housing call with a client, it's really important that we can discuss actually those discriminatory factors that they face that they might not think about. Their criminal record, the fact that they're a young parent, or they're a beneficiary, or they have a disability, all these different things that they might not think as being discriminatory, but they are. Affordability comes into it, issues with like social interactions, things like that with their neighbors as well. The current wait time is 8 months, and Kāinga Ora and community housing providers should theoretically be picking A20s and then A19s and then down the list. However, it's simply not the case. They often look at people that are A18 and above as being too complex to house. They're going to cause issues with their neighbors where they put them. So they just kind of leave them sitting there until you do what Joel had to do, really drive home and advocate to just get some kind of basic level of assistance. There's a lot of people that are just not getting the help. Labour claimed in their conference that they solved chronic homelessness, and they couldn't be further from the truth.
And then of course we've touched on rheumatic fever and respiratory illnesses, but there's lots and lots of knock-on effects from this in terms of housing being the leading driver of child poverty. I think we can all see why that is the case here. With as rents and house prices increase and incomes aren't increasing, and all of the issues that come from that, mental health issues, leading on to educational outcomes and teen suicide rates and imprisonment rates. All these sorts of things really do, all do kind of spring from this poisoned well, and that of course creates all sorts of costs for us further down the road.
That's absolutely right, Geoff. Housing is at the base of so many of our societal issues, and all those things you just listed. It comes back to housing. We have to get this right. And we just can't leave it to these establishment parties because they just haven't done anything and they don't have any policies to do anything. So
Sorry, I just wonder, because since Matthew and Brendon are both in Nelson, I wonder if it's worth pulling them in to talk about the environmental side of this as well, because the attempts that have gone into solving the housing crisis thus far have really just encouraged sprawl. People to keep building houses over more and more productive land. So rather than building up, and that then creates transport issues, all those sorts of things. And I think Nelson's a really good example of that. Perhaps you two could talk about that.
Yeah, well, just to kick us off, 18 months ago, I was in search of something to buy, anything to get out of renting. Just let me know what it was. And the cheapest thing I could possibly find was a piece of land. And even then, the cheapest piece of land you could get was maybe $250,000 in Nelson. And so you start looking further and further afield. You sort of justify yourself, well, maybe I can move out to Mapua. It's not a far distance to drive, maybe 20 minutes of petrol each and every day back and forth. And then you figure out, okay, no, actually, that land might be $230,000, but it's a bit bigger. And, there was a point where we were looking to get some land out in St. Arnaud, which is
St. Arnaud?
Yes, absolutely.
That's Nelson Lakes.
I know, but that's where we were at, and we actually drove the distance to just figure out whether or not this was rational. And still, that piece of land was like $180,000. We weren't necessarily saving all that much, but
an hour's drive from Nelson. That's like an hour's drive, isn't it?
Yeah. And we were thinking about the kids, taking them to school, all this sorts of stuff, just to get off that train where rents are increasing 10% every year. Your income's certainly not doing that. And so it just illustrates that, in trying to solve this problem, we're trying to buy the cheaper land that's on the fringes, and then we start hitting productive land.
Yeah, we'll come back to that environmental side in a minute, but Matt's just reminded me of something that, when we're talking about overall sustainability, which is the real big picture here, one element of that is social sustainability. Now, when a city keeps sprawling and spreading further and further out, generally the people who are getting pushed further and further away from the heart of the city are the poorer people and the younger generations. And that is really unfair. You're putting the people who actually need to be around communities and support the most further and further away. And that is just so unsustainable. That is the sort of thing that, in 20, 30 years from now is going to lead to quite a breakdown in our in society in our cities. On the environmental side, if we are really serious about becoming, reducing our emissions and becoming carbon neutral in 2050, what we really have to do is move away from a car-centric transport system. We've got to have completely redesign our thinking around transport. The only way forward is to move to more public transport and more active, modes of transport, cycling and things like that. Sure, we can slowly change our car fleet to electric cars, but that's not the long-term answer. There's still a huge environmental cost of building any sort of car, doesn't matter what it is. We can only move to proper, good, clean public transport and have good cycling, walking networks if we live closer together and not, an hour away from where you work. That is the way forward. And we can only do that when we actually get a proper urban development strategy that allows us to do that properly. But, we haven't even started throughout the country to think about proper public transport. I mean, this should have been happening 30, 40 years ago. We had more trains operating 50 years ago than we do now in our cities.
And I mean, you were saying, Matthew, how many people work in Nelson City Centre as opposed to living in Nelson City Centre?
Yeah, so we've basically, if you take the centre of Nelson, which is just outside Farmers, and I believe it's a 200-metre circle, if you draw one out there, we've only actually got 75 people living in what you would call the city centre. But yet, every day, thousands of people travel into Nelson just to go to work in that sort of same space. So it's just bonkers in terms of everybody coming in, clogging the roads on their way just to work where there's plenty of space there for people to live if we had the right incentives around that.
And I guess down your way, Joel, people are commuting from Cromwell, aren't they, to work in Queenstown, in terms of Brendon's comment about the lower income workers getting pushed out.
Yeah, so for example, I couldn't even count how many friends I've lost through the housing crisis down here. At a time, there was probably about 70% of the housing was just used for Airbnbs or just sitting empty. I've had really close friends, shout out to Greg, who's just bought a house in Athol, and he commutes from Athol every day. He drives into town to build. At the moment, he's building retirement homes for the rich. So his job, he drives from Athol all the way in to build these retirement homes for the rich, and he drives all the way back to Athol every single day. It is just draining him. Then I've got all these other people that have moved to, and then everyone's just saying to me, oh man, you've got to buy outside the bubble, get into the market, buy outside the bubble. A few years, the bubble will expand and then you can sell it and move on. It's just like, nah, man, I'm not playing that game. It's like Monopoly is fully rigged. It's like we're all jumping onto the board and everyone's already got all the houses and all the hotels all decked out, but there's nothing left for us. It's like,
Lamb to the slaughter.
Every time you roll the dice, you're just getting stung again. It's just like,
Such a depressing but accurate analogy.
Starting Monopoly when all the hotels are set up. Yeah.
And the stupid thing is, we're talking about the number of people or the number of families on the waiting list for social housing, 18,000 now. does anyone know how many empty houses there are in New Zealand at the moment that are, most of them, you could say, are essentially being land banked because they're not being used, or they're being used once a month by people? Does anyone have an idea? I'm sure some.
Yeah, it's over 190,000.
Yeah,
And it's 40,000 in Auckland alone.
And between the number in Auckland, at about 40,000, that went up 18% just between the last two census, 2000 and what's that, 15 to 18, over 3 years, went up 18%. The number of houses being bought and kept and just being left empty. Now, if that's not because of a tax system that rewards you for just owning property and leaving it empty and creating more of a demand, I don't know what is.
So, translation, TOP's property policy would make all those 190,000 currently unproductive assets have to become productive overnight. So what do they have to do? Fill them with tenants. You're welcome.
Yeah. I mean, that really is about the tax system, right? Because we are, though, as Brendon said, the owners of those properties can make more money just by letting them sit empty and wait for the capital gain, the price to go up. It's effectively land banking by another name. So you wait for the price to go up, and you make more money that way than by renting it out. We have to kill capital gain. We have to stop house prices and rents rising, so that people have an incentive to actually use these properties, build on the land, rent out the houses that you've actually got. Housing problem solved.
Vote TOP. So that brings us to about the 45-minute mark. So I don't know, Joe, if we were taking questions tonight. I didn't tell anyone that we were. So sorry, and I can't see your Facebook comments right now. So I'm really sorry if you have been asking questions. I just can't see them. But thank you so much for joining us this evening. It is a really important conversation that we all need to be having. And just because we've been dealing with a COVID crisis right now does not mean that this housing crisis has magically disappeared. And if anything, the numbers are showing us that it is just getting so much worse. Because all that inequality and all those people who were struggling before COVID will only struggle so much harder now and going forward. We need to do things differently. Otherwise, we're going to continue to see this problem getting worse, because it's been getting consistently worse for the last 30 years. We really have to address this and address it now. And again, you're not going to see this fixed if you vote Labour or National, because they fundamentally do not have a plan or any courage to deal with it. And that is why we're all here, because we are absolutely sick and fed up of waiting for them to do it. So thank you for joining us this evening.
I just wondered if Ben, have you got any final comments? You haven't had a chance to speak in the last wee while.
Oh man, as rental prices keep increasing, something that's really bugging me is that, so mortgages are more expensive, rent's going to keep increasing. The government is likely going to have to keep revising how much we're actually putting into accommodation supplement. Currently, there's different levels. In Canterbury here, the maximum is $105 a week. In Auckland, it's $150. But they're just going to have to bump that up. They've got no other choice. And in the end, I think the numbers from the quarterly report show we spent, I think, $456 million on accommodation supplement in the last 3 months. 456 million.
So that's $2 billion a year. Yeah.
That's over half of all housing support grants put together. And that's just going to keep increasing. And it's essentially, we're just funding the landlord to just continually increase rents. It's insane. It has to stop.
Yeah, that really is ambulance at the bottom of the cliff stuff, and that is kind of where the point that we're trying to make about building up the community housing sector to comes in to get them to provide a much greater array of at cost rentals, as we see around the world in places like Europe. They can actually provide, if we let them scale up, can provide a much larger volume of housing, a spectrum of housing for people, on lower incomes. So there we go, fixing the tax system, fixing the supply side, getting those community housing people sorted, and also in the short term, sorting out the rental sector. That's got to happen in the short term until we can actually solve this problem, because it is going to take holding house prices and rents stable for a generation to be able to resolve this particular issue. Great to see Ben's cat and Joel's dog getting involved in the show too. Thanks, guys, for keeping it real.
And thank you, all of you and my team, for being here this evening. Thank you for your contributions. I'm sure everybody watching really valued and really appreciated what you had to say. Thanks, team. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in and being with us this evening. Take care.
Ka kite.
Ka kite anō.